It's the end of May 1940. And is the end in sight for the British Army in France?
Desperate for a military ally, Winston Churchill's eyes turned towards America.
But without the USA, can Prime Minister Churchill inspire Britain to fight on? Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. Hello, I'm Richard Toye, and with me is my good friend and evil twin, Warren Dockter.
Hi, Richard.
And we're looking at the summer of 1940 and Churchill's famous Fight Them on the Beaches speech. But what we're going to do is try and put that in some kind of context to show that it wasn't just a few inspiring sentences, that it was a carefully thought out strategy. And to do that, we're going to have to go back to the autumn of 1939.
Richard, it's great to be here as your dastardly doppelganger. But I also agree with you that it's important for us to zoom out and see the context in which this is happening. Churchill's strategy here really is about understanding his audiences and that they are global and not just people in Britain or Europe. And as well as he can, with whatever he can, building any kind of alliance with anyone who will work with him.
And that's right. And so if you remember, of course, that Churchill had been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty in September 1939, after his so-called wilderness years. He was somebody who at this point had quite a high public profile in Britain as one of the most effective, if not the most effective, speech maker in the government. And after a month of the war, he gives a broadcast which sort of summarizes developments so far. Well, so far, so interesting. But what's crucial is that this has got an audience in the USA as well as in the UK and, of course, across Europe and other parts of the world. And in America, it's relayed via 275 wireless stations. So it's kind of big news.
Yeah, it's tremendously big news. And the fact that it's already pulling in that many stations, I mean, think of today, and as you know, in the United States, there has long been a deep strand of political isolationism that America should focus on itself, not really concern itself with whatever's going on in Europe. And Churchill, I think, knows American history well enough to know that and to know that he's going to be combating that. So I think he, in this speech, and you're the speech man, so I'll let you talk about it, but he drives into American culture right at its heart by mentioning the American Civil War.
Right. And so he does try to make a comparison between the war that is currently going on, World War II, and the American Civil War of 1861 to 65. And so he's got this sentence where he says, all the heroism of the South could not redeem their cause from the stain of slavery, just as all the courage and skill which the Germans always show in war will not free them from the reproach of Nazism. And kind of not a man to panic, I don't think, but he sort of has second thoughts about this and gets a little bit worried, at least, about whether or not, during this comparison between the Nazis and the Confederacy, could actually be, go down badly in the United States and sort of essentially backfire.
I sort of can't help but wonder if you were to reflect upon that even now. I mean, there are still deep wounds as it relates to the American Civil War. And I imagine that there are places in America that are still deeply isolationist that still would reel at the idea that Churchill had made a comparison between the Confederacy and the Nazis. But one of the elements of this story that I find the most remarkable is that in trying to fill out the situation, quite nervous that he had upset American sentiment, he turns to somebody you wouldn't expect at all that he would turn to.
And that, of course, we're talking about Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy.
Right. The American ambassador who Churchill historically, I think he referred to him as no true friend of Britain. Increasingly, Churchill was distrustful of Joseph Kennedy. If you read Churchill's memoirs and several of the biographies around Churchill, Joseph Kennedy's always cast in the light of this sort of, not an arch nemesis, but someone who's certainly not on Churchill's side. And the fact that he turned to him to see if it was okay. And of course, Kennedy reported back to Churchill that FDR, President Roosevelt, was very pleased with that broadcast.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose the other important thing to mention is that FDR, who had been elected, of course, as president in 1932 and was on the verge of running for a third term, unprecedented third term, he and Churchill had been corresponding since the autumn of 1939. Now, remember that they had actually met briefly some decades before. Churchill didn't seem to really remember that, which was sort of a slight awkwardness when they met again, because Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary to the Navy, and Churchill, who had already been a sort of prominent politician for some years, was probably meeting Assistant Secretaries to this or that all the time. But what's interesting really is that they kind of have this effectively a back channel of communication. Ultimately that correspondence between 1939 and 1945, just before Roosevelt's death, extends to sort of three very substantial published volumes. Anyway, it's certainly significant that Roosevelt has recognized Churchill as a kind of important interlocutor, even this early, even well before he is prime minister. And it is, I think, really important that what Churchill says in public is very often directed to not only American opinion in general, which of course he wants to win over, but very much so to the ears of President Roosevelt in particular.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting if you look at how Churchill's quite harsh in his language, again, going back to the European side of it. When he talks about neutral countries, each one hopes that if he feeds the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last, is sort of references to totalitarian regimes, and in this instance, Nazi Germany as a crocodile, is something that he'll return to a whole lot in his rhetoric, and I think that it's tremendously powerful.
Absolutely. Of course, to a certain extent, that was a message which was very explicitly directed towards European neutrals who were in immediate danger, clearly were in immediate danger from the Nazis, but it also could have been regarded as a somewhat pointed address to isolationist type opinion in the United States. And of course, it's worth saying that although there's this sort of seemingly warm relationship in private, the Americans are not doing anything really concrete to sort of help the British at this stage. They are staying out of the fight. There is a presidential election due in 1940. And you've got to remember that, of course, FDR was a very clever politician and somebody who was, although some people thought he was dictatorial, he was somebody who was very alive to the possibilities of what could needed to be achieved through Congress. He knew he couldn't just sort of override Congress and start doing things purely by himself. There was a certain amount of wiggle room, perhaps, but basically he knew that before America could be brought into the war, and we don't know exactly when he finally concluded that where that was, because he's a very sort of difficult person to read, who kind of kept his views to himself.
He's extremely mercurial as well.
Yes, and very good at sort of persuading other people that he agreed with them. I mean, sure you know it, there's a great joke where Roosevelt is in the Oval Office and the Secretary to the Treasury comes to him and says, we need to do some more sort of Keynesian type spending and public works to get the economy going. And Roosevelt says, yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. Man goes away. The next time the president of the Federal Reserve comes in and says, we need to balance the budget. We need to create stability in order to generate prosperity. And Roosevelt says, you're right. You're absolutely right. And then Eleanor Roosevelt has been there all along, sitting, doing her knitting. And she says, Franklin, dear, those two men came in and they said exactly opposite things. And you told them they were both right. And he scratches his chin and says, Eleanor, you're right. You're absolutely right.
And that is a remarkable power that he had, and this is in lots of people's. I think it's in Harry Hopkins' papers, as a matter of fact.
Harry Hopkins is sort of a key advisor and sort of a very sort of close personal friend of Roosevelt.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Just in his private papers, he reflects on the fact that no matter who went to see Roosevelt, they came away happy because they thought they had flipped him, and they may have had no effect on him whatsoever.
Yeah, it may seem that we've kind of strayed a little bit away from sort of Churchill at this point, but actually this dynamic is very, very crucial. And sort of Churchill also is alive to when it is worth making an appeal to the Americans and when not. So sort of very, very soon after Churchill becomes prime minister, on 10th of May 1940, Jan Christian Smuts, the South African prime minister is sort of advocating an immediate appeal to the US to help defend world liberty. Whereas Churchill at this point says, well, this would be kind of premature, it would be embarrassing, and it would look like groveling. So he's not just let's appeal to the Americans under any circumstances.
No, and I really think that echoes a lot of his own positions as it relates to any kind of negotiation or diplomatic relationship, which is never negotiate from a position of weakness. And you can see, I think, that reinforced because he would have been aware that William Phillip Sims, who is an editor for Scripps Howard, basically had said, America wants to kind of see you be in this thing, and that there needs to be a broad, forceful statement that Britain should carry on this war until it has won whatever the cost may be. And I think that Churchill onboards that message.
Right. But then I think what we've got to is this position where Churchill has become prime minister. He's built up something of a relationship with Roosevelt, but he hasn't got that sort of absolute trust. There is still a lot hanging in the balance. He knows he can't just call on the Americans to support and expect them to deliver it. And so it is this dynamic which is really important at the point immediately after the British are making the very dramatic and ultimately surprisingly successful evacuation from Dunkirk.
So that's the big picture on the Anglo-American relationship.
And after the break, we'll come back and discuss how that influenced the way in which the dramatic evacuation from Dunkirk played out in the public and the global press. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. And now we're going to focus on the catastrophe of Dunkirk, but also the way in which the British forces were delivered from an even worse fate.
So it's the 23rd of May, and Churchill is going to have to go to the House of Commons and report what's going on with the Germans and just what kind of advances that they had made pursuing the expeditionary force.
Yeah, and so he tells the Commons that the Germans have penetrated into the rear of the Allied armies in Belgium. Abbeville has fallen. And 5 days after that, on the 28th, he has to announce that King Leopold of Belgium has surrendered his army against the wishes of the king's own government. And so Churchill warned the MPs to expect hard and heavy tidings, as he put it.
So at that point, it's obvious that an evacuation is going to have to take place because effectively the Germans now have pushed the entire British expeditionary force and what remains of the sort of French fighters kind of increasingly off the continent. And it's that point that what is known as Operation Dynamo began. That's the 26th of May.
There was sort of hope that maybe they could get 20 or 30,000 men off. And of course, the context behind the scenes, as we discussed last time, is these debates in the cabinet about whether or not it is worth trying to explore peace terms and find out whether Hitler is willing to do some kind of a deal.
Right. So this is one of those like fulcrum moments in history, and there's no way to kind of overemphasize this in my head. I'm going to romanticize this slightly, Richard.
Okay.
So if you think of the story about the 300, right, going all the way back to ancient Greek history, and there's a famous phrase, and it was used, I think, later in the film 300 about our arrows will blot out the sun, and the Spartans sort of reply that we'll fight in the shade. For me, this is the modern equivalent of that moment because Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe have enough planes in the skies to blot out the sun over Dunkirk and to attack the British Navy and all of the volunteer ships that come to help rescue the expeditionary forces. It magically, and magically is not the right word, it's through hard grit and force and a lot of amazing things that they're able to actually rescue a huge number of troops compared to the 20 or 30,000 that they thought they'd get.
Yes. So, eventually there were 335, nearly 336,000 Allied troops rescued. 224,000 of those were British, the rest were French. Some of those French troops eventually decided to return to France. I guess I would caution a little bit against the sort of the romanticizing of it again with the little ships, which is a beautiful thing for films, and was in fact sort of instantly mythologized by the writer and playwright J.B. Priestley in one of his most famous broadcasts. In practice, it was the Royal Navy who took the vast bulk of the troops away. And of course, arguably, tactical or strategic errors by Hitler in terms of not ordering further advances, which made this possible. But I mean, the film Dunkirk in 2017 has some merits of a film as a film. But one thing that struck me was that the director Christopher Nolan didn't want to use computer generated imagery. He wanted to make it all real. Now, of course, the effect of that was that he simply couldn't get enough people on the beaches to make it look like it would have done in 1940. So it was sort of like they looked like sparsely populated, well, I won't say holiday makers, but you know what I mean. There were obviously were hundreds of thousands of people waiting to be evacuated, enormously difficult, but ultimately successful logistical operation. And this is a sort of a glimpse of light in a very dark situation.
Well, and just to go back to the Christopher Nolan thing, I mean, he also couldn't get enough Messerschmitts, authentic, German Luftwaffe planes to present the reality of what that would have looked like from that perspective either. And we're not criticizing Christopher Nolan. I can't say that strong enough. We both love Christopher Nolan. He should also support this podcast. But it's one of those things where it's a moment that allows not just Churchill but Great Britain and the Allies a moment to think this is going to be catastrophic. And it's bad. I don't want to make light of the situation that it's in. And there's lots of reasons. Like you said, we know that Hitler did a sort of strategic pullback and thought that he might be able to get a kind of negotiated peace in that moment. There's lots of reasons, but and I am sorry, I do like to over romanticize things. I don't want to let history get in the way of a good story. But having said that, it's remarkable that even though it is a military loss, right, it's still, they're able to snag a pretty significant number of people. And the effect that would have on the national morale is sort of, it's a priceless effect. I mean, there's no way to kind of quantify the knock on effect that this has for Britain.
The same time, we have to kind of acknowledge that this didn't go down particularly well with the French. So I have to introduce another film, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where there's the famous bit about brave Sir Robin ran away, and from the French point of view, that's what they think is going on. Now, of course, you could easily say there was no point in these troops, which had lost a great deal of their weapons and equipment. There was no point them staying there and either getting massacred or captured. But it is worth saying that this is one of the things which feeds into the worsening, and ultimately the poisoning of much of Anglo-French relations.
Right. And it becomes a harbinger of something that is much more significant later on, and we'll deal with that later in the podcast.
So how does this actually all relate to Churchill, and how are we going to bring back the story of the Anglo-American relationship into the aftermath of Dunkirk? Well, I think the first thing to say is that Churchill recognizes that this is not something to boast about too much. And he gives this famous speech on 4th of June, 1940, the so-called fight on the beaches speech, but there's a lot more to it than just that famous passage. So Churchill stresses we must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance, that is to say, the evacuation from Dunkirk, the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. And he goes on to describe the events in France and Belgium as a colossal military disaster. So that's kind of like peak honesty, really. And I do remember reading diary of a sort of ordinary guy later in the war saying, occasionally you catch politicians telling the truth. They don't do it very often, but occasionally in certain situations out it comes. And here is an absolutely frank admission, and in a sense to start to sort of warn against any kind of triumphalism come out of this, that he didn't want this to be romanticized. Actually, he wanted it to be acknowledged for the success that it was within limited terms, but he wanted to say, look, we're really in a catastrophic situation, and he wanted people to appreciate that, because that required further preparation, planning, and a lot of hard work in order to actually recover from that.
And I just think I should also say, from the American perspective, a couple points. I mean, number one, There are, and it's significant, I think, there are 18 foreign diplomats who watched Churchill give that speech in the gallery. So Churchill's, again, tuning in that kind of international awareness, not just of what the world thinks, but in particular what America thinks. And even so, and you can see this in Churchill's archives in Cambridge, there's a deleted statement where he characterizes, well, he characterizes the United States, but he says, the United States continues to watch with a strange detachment the growth and advance of dangers which menaces them ever more darkly. And he removed that because he doesn't want to cast America in any kind of negative light. He wants them to be aware that there's a sort of, again, that this, they've suffered a defeat, and he wants the Americans to see that they're sort of still distant from it, but he didn't want to come out and say that. But he does something I think that's actually infinitely more clever, and I'm going to read some of the romantic stuff here, but echoing something we discussed earlier. And these words, I've got to pause to say this. When I first heard him speak this when I was in college, I went to the library at the University of Tennessee where I did my undergraduate, went and listened to Churchill's speeches for a class that I was doing on British history. And this was the very first speech, the very first clip of a speech I ever heard come from his mouth, and I think of it to this day. We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Now that's tremendously powerful. I just want to say, he says there, whatever the cost may be, which is exactly what the newspaper man in the United States said he needed to say. And I think that that's a remarkable thing that he's that aware. This is the moment to draw the line in the sand.
Well, I'm going to build on that because, in a sense, in the documentaries which we see so often, they kind of play the bit which you have just quoted, and then they fail to quote the next bit, which goes on. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it was subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. And, you might well say, well, why would you add those sentences on, given that you've just already kind of written a perfect little passage? And then there's a good reason for that, because that, again, this is a message, the sort of the second part of the message is explicitly crafted to appeal to the United States. And actually, just a few days before, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King of Canada had sent Churchill a telegram. This was on 31st of May, and he reports Roosevelt's opinion that if resistance became impossible in British waters, the fleet shouldn't be surrendered, but it should be sent to Canada, South Africa, Australia, or the Caribbean. So actually, the Americans are sort of thinking, well, the chances that the British are going to hold out on the island of Great Britain are really quite slim. And, well, actually, we've just got to sort of think about, preparing for that worst case scenario. And what we need to know, what we need in terms of reassurance, is that wouldn't be the end of the story. The fight would be carried on from elsewhere in the British Empire through the transfer of the fleet. And that's really explicitly what Churchill is saying in talking about the empire beyond the seas carrying on the struggle. And this goes down well in America, where, as I say, people are thinking, well, maybe Britain is going to fall, but they want to be reassured that other parts of the empire will carry on the fight, which of course will enhance the security of the United States as well. If the entirety of the British Empire falls, then the USA is in a much worse position. So really, Churchill is sending a message that reflected not only what the American government wanted to hear and what the American people to a great extent wanted to hear, it also reflects what he knew that they wanted to hear.
Which again, the brilliance of his rhetoric is remarkable. And as you know, we're familiar with that kind of last clause when he talks about the empire and mentions the Commonwealth, the empire beyond the seas. If you take into account the production value of the entire English Commonwealth, there was no chance that the Germans were ever going to win.
So, of course, this message that the war will be continued from beyond the seas in the British Empire, sort of German propagandists sort of immediately sort of pick up on that and say, oh, well, the British governing classes are kind of proposing to run away. German radio saying that Churchill was a miserable despot warmonger who was signaling his intention of deserting the millions whom he has led to disaster. Well, this, of course, is nonsense, but if it does point to a propaganda vulnerability in the messaging that he's given. But really, of course, this is, as we've said, a message which is aimed towards American opinion. And there it does go down very well.
But the real power, I think, or the real sentiment is described by one of my favorite historical characters, Edward R. Murrow, who was a famous sort of press man in the United States. He was a CBS correspondent at the time, and he commented on Churchill's honesty, inspiration, and gravity of this speech. And so you can see that this speech is seen in many quarters as a very powerful thing, but there are also places where it was seen different.
Well, yeah, and I think that that's absolutely the case, that with in any speech, we've got to remember that it's easy to just listen to a Churchill speech and be moved by the sort of literary skill and the sort of the emotion in the words. But these were political speeches, and that they were always things which created a divided reaction. And even at home, those people who write in their diaries, ordinary people who write a great speech which sort of didn't gild the lily. But there are also those who didn't find it cheering, who thought it was more or less a warning to expect war in England and some kind of street fighting. But I think that what it did do was that it also helped cement Churchill's position at home. It did contribute to winning over the Conservative Party, which was still resentful over the treatment of Neville Chamberlain. We got to remember, of course, that France at this point, although the military situation was disastrous, was technically still in the war. France hadn't surrendered yet. And so the other part of the message is we will carry on for, if necessary, we'll carry on for years, if necessary, alone. And there are a lot of people who suddenly wake up at those words and say, alone? What do you mean alone? Does this mean that the French are going to drop out of the war? Without saying it explicitly, that's exactly what Churchill is trying to hint at. So it's a complicated message. That is obviously a depressing message, and therefore it's received negatively by some people. But ultimately, Churchill had balanced these demands of domestic rhetoric and international rhetoric, and being as frank as possible about the military situation with remarkable skill. So, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill has set out his course to fight on, whatever the cost may be.
Stirring words. The words alone cannot halt the German forces from sweeping across France.
How can Churchill respond as the crisis becomes ever more grave?
To find out, join us next time here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.